Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Josh Wonders Why. Glad you're taking time out of your busy schedule to come join us from our studio here, myself and Pastor Kelly. It's always a pleasure to see you here.
And you too as well, Josh.
Thank you. So cordial.
Yes.
So if you're new to this whole Josh Wonders Why experience, or maybe it's been a while, this is a weekly discussion I have typically on Mondays just to discuss whatever's on my mind or on Kelly's mind or on your mind. And it could be, biblical, could be religious, could be current events, could be food, could be pretty much anything. Whatever we want to talk about, nothing's really off limits here. So tonight I figured we're approaching the Juneteenth, which is this Thursday, June 19th. Mm-hmm. And to commemorate that, I want to talk a little about what Juneteenth is, as it is significant significant with regards to slavery, but then also dive into the question of what does the Bible actually say about slavery. There's many passages in the Bible that say slavery is okay. Here's how here's how you should treat slaves, and I want to dive into those verses and discuss how they may have been misused for the slave owners in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, and even maybe today some places. So want to talk about that tonight. So if you have any questions or thoughts on the topic, feel free to chime in on the chat. And as usual, if there's any topics you'd like us to tackle at a future Josh Wonders Why, put those in the chat as well. We'd love to discuss what's on your mind and what is relevant to you. So, and Kelly has 3 books, so she's going to answer all the questions we have.
Yeah.
You came prepared. So this is great.
Yeah.
So first, I want to talk a little bit just about Juneteenth, because I'll be honest, up until probably, I'd say a decade ago, or maybe, no, I'd probably even say 5 years ago, I didn't know what Juneteenth was. But apparently it's been celebrated for a long time.
I didn't either until probably a few years ago.
And I'm probably ashamed to say that I had no understanding of what it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was, to be honest, I thought it was a new holiday that we're going to start celebrating as opposed to something that's been celebrated, for the past.
But it wasn't made officially.
Yes, a federal holiday.
National holiday until
2021 with Biden. So what it is basically on June 19th, it's celebrated to commemorate the ending of slavery in the United States. So if we back up to the Civil War, and I did some research on this, so I'll probably be looking down because I didn't memorize everything, but slavery came to an end in various areas at different times. So the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect on January 1st, 1863, basically promised to freedom to all enslaved people in the rebellious parts of the southern states. But enforcement of that proclamation generally relied on the Union troops to come in and enforce it. If you jump to Texas, that was one of the most remote states of the Confederacy. And it, during this time, saw an expansion of slavery because slave owners and planters from some of the eastern states migrated into Texas to escape the fighting and escape the Union soldiers and continue their lifestyle in Texas as it being the most remote state.
What I read that the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to border states that had remained in the Union. So
that's
technically, even though they were Union states, people could have slaves there still.
Yeah. So it was estimated by 1865 there were about 250,000 enslaved people in Texas just from the migration of everybody moving into Texas. So even though the Civil War ended with the surrender of Robert E. Lee in April in 1865, the enforcement was really slow and inconsistent. It just depended on when the Union troops could get into the various regions. And what happened on June 19th, 1865 is the Union soldiers, a guy named Major General Gordon Granger and about 2,000 of his troops made it to Galveston Bay in Texas and ordered a final enforcement of the proclamation, which for the most part ended slavery. Now, it is worth noting that by this time, almost all enslaved people have been freed. However, there were remaining states like Delaware and Kentucky. They didn't, acknowledge the freedom until December of that year when they actually ratified the 13th Amendment, which is probably the border states you were talking about, at least Delaware. So I think from June 19th, it's sort of that's where Juneteenth comes from, is a conglomeration of June and 19th. And I think that is the significant date that most people celebrate because that is when the majority of enslaved people were finally free.
Yeah. Sort of.
Yeah, sort of, yes.
Sort of.
I mean, it was still an uphill battle. That's still today, but at least that's a significant step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Now, one thing, I was reading some commentary by some African Americans, and I never considered this, but I found this as interesting, is that, Juneteenth marks our country's second Independence Day.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at July 4th, right, it's about liberty, but it's about an imperfect liberty because slavery was still legally existing in the nation during that time.
Mm-hmm.
Also, some of the commentary was that in their minds, July 4th feels really fixed just to 1776. We celebrate the birth of the nation, the Declaration of Independence, Hamilton, everything else from 1776, whereas Juneteenth in their minds feels fluid and always willing to be adaptable to the incoming and upcoming generations. They continue to use that to build up and look for signs of hope for the future. It also helps place African Americans as the center of the conversation about freedom and its meaning and manifestation to the nation. I think the Juneteenth, I think it's more and more important now that, people and organizations are trying to move forward with censoring much of our history and trying to hide some of this, some of these, these events from the public. This helps to at least make it more public, that maybe it's not taught in schools, but at least once a year something say, what's Juneteenth? And, public libraries at least have books, and everything else has books that people can at least continue to commemorate and learn more about the event, right?
Yeah.
And the history. So that's pretty much what I was able to find from Juneteenth. So that's the background. Like I said, I'm sad that I didn't realize until a couple years ago the significance of Juneteenth. Up to that point, I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's because of it was just sort of not part of the history books growing up that was taught. Maybe it was, and I just never considered it as a celebration.
In my history classes, we never seemed to get much past the Civil War. It's like, we ran out of time, so we can't cover anything else. But
sorry.
By golly, I learned those battles.
Yeah, I know. I had to label them on a map where they all occurred, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that topic of slavery, I felt I wanted to tie back into the Bible. Because the Bible has a lot to say about
otherwise,
slavery.
why am I here?
Yeah. No, what? So looking back on, we'll just say slavery in general or in the U.S., I think there was a lot of, at the time, the slave owners used the Bible to justify this is why it's okay to do slavery. And I wanted to dabble in some of that stuff and discuss, what are some verses that the Bible has that maybe these slave owners would use to say that's why it's right.
Yeah. It's just symbolic of so many ways that Christians use Scripture to justify
and
their beliefs and their attitudes.
And I'm learning more, like our discussion last week on, is there really a biblical family? Does the Bible really explain or prescribe what a biblical family is? In the past, we've talked about, different ways to read the Bible, right? Consider it, as a historical text, but there's other ways to read it. One thing that I'm going to start applying is the question of, is what I'm reading a documentation of the social norms of the time, or is it a divine prescription to say this is an act that God says we continue to do, right?
Mm-hmm. It's all about the context.
Yep, that's right.
It's like real estate, location, location, location. In the Bible, it's context, context, context.
Yep. So I think the first verse, or the first thing that I was able to come across was in Genesis. There's something called the curse of Ham. And I'm not sure if you can help go into detail on that.
Yeah, so Ham was one of Noah's sons, and so he had 3 sons, and this was, after the ark had landed and everything, and so there are different ways of interpreting this, but the nice way is that Ham looked into Noah's tent and saw he was naked. I think he was drunk and naked, passed out, whatever. and he told his brothers, and his brothers put like a blanket over their shoulders and walked backwards. They didn't want to see him, but they wanted to cover him up. But then he found out that Ham had looked at him, and some interpretations say it was more than just looking. But so he, because I'm thinking, well, I don't know. Anyway, actually, Noah cursed Canaan, the son of Ham.
Okay.
And his other sons were not cursed. So I don't know why he's picking on this one grandson. I don't know. But the curse was not irreversible. Many Canaanites, because Canaan was, like the father of the Canaanite nation, and a lot of other ites that you read about in the Old Testament. But they generally worshipped pagan gods. But there were some Canaanites that turned away from the idols and worshipped God, like Rahab, the prostitute, who believed in God. And when the soldiers came to, or the spies, Moses sent the spies to check out Jericho and see if they could take it, and she hid them. And then she said, "Remember me and my family when you come to attack." And so they did. They got her out and her family out, and then everybody else was killed. And so she's actually in the lineage of Jesus. So, but she's a Canaanite. Also Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba that David had killed, he was a Canaanite. Now, the name Ham in Hebrew can mean hot or black. And so that's
where they get that from?
That's where they get it, but it has nothing to do with skin color. There's nothing in that scripture there that says anything about the color of their skin. But because one of the meanings of Ham is black, I think they just glommed onto that and went, "Oh, well, there you go. This is how you interpret this." So
it makes sense.
Yeah.
That means and I think also it feeds in then there are then future verses in like Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy that basically there are laws that regulate slavery rather than abolish it. And I think it could have been misinterpreted as divine approval, saying you can have slavery, right?
Right.
You can, or you can be slave owners.
It is more about the social norms of the time. It is about an ancient civilization where that was how you did things. If you wanted more land, then you had to go fight the people there, and you had to take it and kill them.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's saying that's how God wants us to run things right now.
Yeah.
It was a cultural norm of the time, and so was the slavery of that time, where, sometimes they would take slaves, prisoners of war, and then enslave them. And that was one kind of slavery in the biblical times. Another form of slavery in the Bible is where people sell themselves into slavery, say you have a debt that you can't repay, and your choices are go to prison or, rent yourself out as a slave until you pay off your debt.
Yeah.
So that's not like the slavery that we had in the Americas.
Yeah. And that's one thing because I guess if you go through then, because there's also New Testament texts that say, slaves, obey your earthly masters, respect and fear in Ephesians. And then, Paul instructs slaves to obey their masters without condemning slavery, implying its acceptability. However, that was advice for the existing system at the time.
That kind of slavery was not what we're talking about in the history of our country. As far as I know, I'm not saying that it didn't exist at all.
Yeah.
And there, the whole thing, like we talked about last week, about pedastry, where an adult male would take a young man and, have a sexual relationship, and that wasn't always consensual. So, that could have been a type of slavery. In Exodus 21, it also talks about buying women, foreign women, as slaves, but then either the man would marry the slave or give the slave to his son to marry. So it was like, I don't know. So like, nobody among our clan will take my son. I'll have to go buy a slave because nobody else wants to marry him.
Must be an ugly son. No,
so, yeah. In Leviticus 25, there are different rules for Israelites and foreigners when it comes to slaves. So you couldn't do certain things to an Israelite slave that you could do to a foreign slave. And also, the year of Jubilee, you had to give all your Israelite slaves their freedom, but not necessarily foreign slaves. So, in Deuteronomy 20 through 24, you name that one too. That's Jesus. Jesus clarified that because somebody asked him about divorce, and Moses allowed us to give a certificate of divorce to our wife, and Jesus was like, yeah, but what you're doing isn't right.
Yeah.
This in Deuteronomy, it was like, yeah, you can give a certificate of divorce, but you've got to prove that it's warranted. It can't just be, I don't like her anymore. And Jesus was like, because what was happening, a man could give a woman in Jesus's time as well a certificate of divorce, but then she was on her own, and she had no recourse, she had no money, she couldn't even take her children with her. Jesus was going, that's not what Moses intended.
Yeah.
So he was trying to protect women, and the Deuteronomy chapters also sort of seek to protect the woman. One of the disturbing things in there is that if a man rapes a woman out where nobody could hear her scream. So if a woman got raped in town, she was supposed to scream and someone would come save her. If she didn't, that meant that she was okay with it. But if she got raped outside of town where maybe nobody could hear her scream, then it wasn't her fault. But he had to marry her. That's messed up.
We could probably spend a whole month just unpacking those 700 and so wahs that, most of them. The camera's flickering. I'm going to go unplug it real quick. Sorry, bear with me.
And, Genesis 17 that you also pulled out about biblical patriarchs owned slaves. Owning slaves was about being wealthy. If you're wealthy and you have a great number of livestock, who are you going to get to take care of them? You can't do it all. Your kids can't do it all. So you got to have slaves. The more you have, the more people you need to take care of it and manage it. How do you think Solomon's temple got built? It goes on and on about all the details of the temple and the, the rare wood and the jewels and everything. That was slave labor that got it done.
Yeah.
Because I'm pretty sure that Solomon didn't pay them. So.
Well, that's interesting. So there's tons of examples of slavery in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And one thing I uncovered, I'd not heard this term before, and I think I was pronouncing it wrong when we were talking about it, is there is a type of slavery that they call what would happen in the U.S. called chattel slavery, I think is how I'm pronouncing it. C-H-A-T-T-E-L.
Tony beat you to it. He's in the comments talking about it.
I don't see any in the comments yet. Okay. Tony has, there we go. Oh, wow, there's lots of comments.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. My phone apparently missed all these comments. So chattel slavery was basically, chattel, my understanding, is a legal term that means tangible, movable person or property. So chattel slavery is a form of slavery where individuals are owned outright, can be bought, sold, inherited, and are considered property for life. Mm-hmm. So when you consider that, there's a good comparison table I found that compared the Hebrew Bible slavery with chattel slavery. I think we covered some of that stuff. Maybe I can just summarize that. If you look at the basis, like you said, the biblical slavery is economic, war, or debt related, whereas chattel slavery is more racial and hereditary. And I think that's an interesting distinguishing that I never thought about. Is the slavery in the U.S. was focused on African Americans and some other minorities, whereas in the Bible it was, we'll say that the majority of the time it was economic, war, or debt related. There could have been some prejudices and racial slavery going on at the time, but the vast majority, or the examples we brought up, were all based off of the conditions of the time and not racially
Well, and what's really
driven.
important to also consider is that slavery in the Americas, when people were kidnapped from the African continent and brought here, they were treated like animals.
Yeah.
And that prevailed through generations, that idea that they're not really human. Or they're 3/5 of a person. They only count as 3/5 of a person or something. Medical experiments were done on slaves without anesthetic because they can't feel it. They're not human. Just awful, terrible things because people dehumanized other people because of the way they looked.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to consider that as well.
Yeah,
as
definitely.
a difference.
Oh yeah, and like you said, the duration. In biblical it was temporary, but then in the Americas it was permanent, and it was hereditary, or maybe generations. They just continued to work for the same slave owner.
And any children born to slaves were property of the owners.
Legally, in the biblical sense, the slaves had some legal rights and protections, but you look at U.S., they're treated as property, as animals, right? There are no rights. I guess the Bible limits on abuse, religious inclusion. They included them in religious ceremonies, whereas America was systemic brutality and dehumanization. The freeing slaves in the Bible was built into the law. There's the Jubilee, which they can, debt is relieved, whereas in America's is rare and is discretionary. And then other thing is interesting, the role in society, right? In the Bible, the slaves are integrated into the households. They're sort of part of the family. They married the ugly son that didn't have any other suitors, right? Yeah. Whereas in America, they were segregated, marginalized, lived out close to the fields. They don't want to educate you, don't want to teach you stuff, don't want you to read, because if you read, you can potentially rebel, right? And just keep them.
Yeah.
So it is interesting, the differences when you look at this. They use it to justify slavery, but they miss the whole point of the slavery that was in the Bible. Like you said, there was a reason for it, and there were rules and laws of how to, do it.
And just because it's in the Bible, and God didn't say, "Thou shalt not have slaves," that doesn't mean that God was okay with it.
Yes.
A lot of things that happened in those ancient times were just part of the way life was. And so God didn't outlaw it, but God put boundaries around it so that there were protections for slaves, even the foreign slaves. There were certain things that you just couldn't do to a slave in the Bible, which did not was not the reality here. And it's like God didn't ordain polygamy. God didn't necessarily approve of it, but it's in there. People did it. Just because he didn't approve of it or ordain it doesn't mean that God thought it was all right. Same thing with slavery, I think.
Yeah. Well, interesting. No, that's a good discussion, because I feel like that's, it's something, unfortunately, like with LGBTQIA plus community. It's just the Bible is used as a weapon against, or a weapon to justify people's views, whereas God's looking down saying, no, that's not
Yeah.
what I intended.
Yeah.
What do you,
Yeah.
why are you
You know,
picking
it's
this?
like the more you know, the better you ought to be doing.
Yeah.
But you know, people can take whatever they want out of the Bible and use it to justify their views.
And I think it's key to, like you said, is take into account the historical context and consider, is it just documenting the social norm at the time? And at the time, you know, that's how they did it to, you know, safety numbers, or that's what happened when they went into an enemy territory and, you know, to build up their armies and their families. Or is it God is saying through divine intervention in the Bible, because we had slavery in the Bible at the time, you guys can do slavery now, right?
Right. Yeah. And
So-
Ashley makes a comment, even today medical professionals often deny pain meds to black individuals because they have a higher pain tolerance, and that is true. That is very true. The mortality rate for maternal deaths, much higher than for white moms. And they just don't, people of color don't get the same attention and the same respect as white people do.
Yep.
I just stated the incredibly obvious.
Well, that's why it's important to have these discussions, right? To educate, to continue to talk about it.
Yeah.
So another thing I want to talk about, so we got that. Let's talk about then, something that interests me, and there's something that's called the Slave Bible. And the actual name of it is Select Parts of the Holy Bible for Use of Negro Slaves in the British West India Islands. And it was published in 1807 by British missionaries, and it was used for use in the British Caribbean, aimed to teach Christianity to slaves, but not to empower them to resist, right? So at the time, they were concerned with freedom-oriented scriptures that might inspire rebellion, like the story of like Exodus, could empower the people to see their condition as unjust. And they're also worried that if it taught literacy through the full Bible, it could lead to critical thinking and resistance, right? Again, trying to censor people, and we don't want you to...
Yeah. Now, some slave owners did educate their slaves.
Yes.
They did teach them to read, but again, selectively. But there were still slaves who somehow got to read more than just the slave Bible, because that's where, you know, the spirituals were birthed out of that. You know, a lot of spirituals about the Exodus and so forth. You know, and I think also when slaves started to you know, run away or be freed or whatever and go north, they sometimes ran into Christians who would say, "Oh, haven't you ever heard this part of the Bible?" You know, and I think they got educated in the whole Bible in that way. And you know, and probably, you know, obtained copies of the whole thing, and then that was passed down through you know, songs or, you know, preaching, and so you just can't suppress the good news.
You can't. But I think it's worth noting that there was a censored Bible to prevent hope. And what I found from the stat said that if you look at this censored Bible, it said that 90% of the Old Testament is missing and 50% of the New Testament is missing. And to put it in a different way, if you look at the standard Protestant Bible, there's about 1,190 chapters throughout the whole Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. If you take the censored Bible, that's reduced to only 232 chapters, which is a pretty significant reduction, right? So,
but I'm sure they left a lot of stuff in there about morality.
They did. So what they included, what was removed examples was liberation of Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Also, Galatians says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. You're all one in Christ Jesus. And Exodus, there's a verse in Exodus says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Those were omitted. Make sense for those, you know, for the slave owners. But what was included? Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. Titus 2:9-10. Slaves are be submissive to their masters and everything. So basically, they made the slave Bible and just centered on the the direction, and probably Paul was rolling in his grave saying, you picked and choose my directions on slavery.
Or Paul's rolling in his grave going, I didn't write that. Somebody put that in later.
Yeah.
Like all the passages about women not being able to teach men. Somebody else wrote that in later. Wasn't me. Yeah, Tony said probably Quakers educated them, and that's probably true.
Yeah. Well, I heard also, I think it happened with, I think it was Frederick Douglass, but I could be mistaken it, but I think he learned to read by one of the slave master's mistresses. She just taught him to read after hours. I think when the slave owner found out about that, he was very mad and stopped that. But then what I found, this is getting off topic, but Frederick Douglass, to continue to learn, he would walk home with kids that were, after school, leaving school, and he would trick them into teaching things by saying, hey, I bet I can read this better than you can. And they would, he learned to read by them reading in front of him, right? So he sort of found a way to go around it. But I feel like that was part of it, is that maybe some of also, whether it was the mistresses or the daughters or the kids of the slave owners, maybe felt more closer to these slaves and said, let me show this Bible and stuff, right?
Well, because sometimes the children of rich people were raised by a slave,
true.
And they became very close to them. And then there were family members who probably thought, this is terrible.
Yeah.
But I'm a woman and I can't do anything about it, but by golly, I'll go behind my husband's back and I'll teach them. So,
yeah. So that's good discussion tonight. So that's what I want to do for Juneteenth, to commemorate it. I want to at least acknowledge our history of our nation with slavery, why the Bible was used to sort of justify the slavery at the time, but also acknowledge that there was a censored Bible that was used that had all the, the freedom and the, the portions taken out.
Reminds me of the Jefferson Bible. Thomas Jefferson wrote a Bible, took out all the parts he didn't like.
That sounds like a Jefferson thing
How
to do.
convenient. Yeah. I think it's really important. I'm glad that you brought this topic up, because I think it's really important, especially today, to continue to be talking about these things and, educating people, because a lot of people just aren't aware. Like we were saying, we didn't know what Juneteenth was.
Yeah. Like I said, up till I think maybe a decade or less ago, it may have been 5-10 years ago, I thought it was when we started talking about Juneteenth and they started I don't know when it was, but people started petitioning to make it a federal holiday. Maybe it was in late 2010s, but I thought this was just a new celebration people wanted to celebrate. I didn't realize how far back it went. It was actually started celebrating. They started celebrating it back in 1866. They started celebrating it, and different pockets of people would celebrate it. And it was only recently that it got the national attention it did. So maybe something to take away as you look towards this week. Maybe this Thursday, look to do something just to commemorate Juneteenth. I don't know what it could be. Whether it's read a book. Maybe post something on Facebook.
Oh
yeah, sorry, you brought all these books and we didn't even acknowledge them.
I've probably shared these on Josh Wonders Why multiple times, but this James Cone, this was in 1970, the first publication, A Black Theology of Liberation. These two books were like the most influential required reading that I had in seminary. This one is Jesus and the Disinherited. And you're going to find outdated ways of talking about things. They're going to they're not going to say people, they're going to say men. They don't mean any disrespect by that, but these are just really impactful books. And then this one, everybody should read this, The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. It is a powerful book, and it talks about the complicity of the church, even the United Methodist Church, in racism and in systemic racism and keeping it going. And I think we've come a long way in the United Methodist Church. We still have a long way to go, but this is really powerful. Talking about Methodist youth groups going to watch a hanging, a lynching. Like that's what youth groups did back then. You didn't have anything else to do. But you know, it was a thing. People
Yeah.
would turn out to watch the lynchings. And, you know, again, that's that, you know, they're not quite human, so we
Yeah.
can do that. Also, there was so much fear. And I think there still is today.
Yeah.
People fear black people because of the way that they've been taught, the way they were brought up. You know, if you're brought up by racist parents, you're going to internalize all that and you're going to believe those things. And but as an adult, I hope that you would educate yourself and throw that off. But you know, there's just you know, it's just like how many black men died because a white woman said he touched me.
Yeah.
You know, and there was just so much fear incited because of those things.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, and I think today we're seeing that as well. You know, certain groups are being vilified as an entire group. You know, nobody ever does that with white people.
Yeah.
You know, they don't just say all white people are, you know, rapists and murderers, even though there are plenty of white people that commit those crimes. But a lot of people don't have any problem with vilifying a whole group of people and calling them that because a few of them are.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to talk about it and fight against it.
Yep. It goes back to, I think we talked about that before. I can't remember. There is the test that you can take. What is it for the stereotypes, or what's that test?
The implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about it before, but if you Google it, implicit bias, was it? Is it Princeton or Harvard? Some college did the test. Do you know?
I don't
know.
remember.
There's
Just
some.
look up implicit bias test.
Yeah, there's some university that has a test, and it's interesting because you're not supposed to think, but it asks you questions, and you select left or right.
You have to do it on a
keyboard.
On a keyboard. You can't do it on your phone.
But it helps you basically. It helps you understand, and it's eye-opening sometimes to say, oh, there is stuff that I didn't think about that maybe I do have a bias towards one group versus
and
another.
You have to take the quiz quickly.
Yes.
Because it's also timing you. So if you try to think it through, and not just react, it counts that against you.
Yeah.
Because you're taking too long.
And it's interesting 'cause stuff that was, based off your upbringing that maybe was, instilled in you that you not considered until you've taken this test, right?
You don't realize it.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting. Although I will say that I did really well on the test about incarceration, like people who are incarcerated, like black men and white men.
Mm-hmm.
I did really well. I scored really well on that one. I did not have bias against black men who'd been incarcerated.
Should print out, put in your refrigerator.
I know. I got a good score on this test. But, because I've educated myself on a lot of that.
Yeah.
And, that school to prison pipeline thing, So,
yeah.
The more we learn, the better we do.
Yep.
I'm not saying I did well on the other tests that I took. Because there are all kinds, there's racism, there's ageism, sexism, all kinds of different tests that you can take. And it's really interesting.
Yeah.
But you'll be mad.
but it's good because you can learn from that.
Yes, you can learn from it.
If you go with open mind, you can learn and say, it's not your fault. It could just be your upbringing that's sort of,
I mean, so much stuff is just implied within our culture.
Yes.
In the United States. It's like, how many times has somebody told me a story or a joke and they never say there was this white guy, or there was this white woman. But if the person is black, they tell me that, like it's some anomaly or something. And I'm like, what does that have to do with the story? Nothing.
Yeah.
So it's stuff like that. We are trained to consider the white person to be the norm.
Yep.
And a lot of times we unconsciously think, everybody just needs to get on the page with the white people. I mean, we don't, and that you say that, you're like, no, I don't think like that. That's why you got to take the test.
Yeah.
And you'll find out that you might have some of that.
Well, there you go. Appreciate all the comments.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my phone has not been updating it, so I'll have to read all the comments afterwards. But so if I do that, it
Yeah.
goes to your Coffee with Kelly, and then I
don't
can't
know.
get back. So appreciate you all watching us. We'll be back again live this Thursday for another Digging Deep. And next Monday, we'll be back with Josh Wonders Why. And we're going to go back to a topic we started last week, as this month is Pride Month, to talk more about LGBT plus topics. Last week was about, does the Bible specify what a family needs to be between, heterosexual family or a homosexual family? And next week, the question is going to be on sexual orientation. Is it biological? Is it environmentally based? Is it a psychological issue? And what does the Bible have to say about that? And we'll be quizzing Kelly, and she'll set us straight on what that is. So
There you go.
talk about sexual orientation. And also, we'll talk about, there are some groups, there are Christians that this is what they use to say, why society should be against them. Like if they talk about trans athletes or, what is it, drag queens or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And go into that detail. So
Yeah.
it should be a good discussion next week to learn more about that, discuss
Will
that.
we talk about gender or just sexual orientation?
Yes.
Okay,
We'll figure
we're
it
going
out.
to talk about both because I think people.
I think we should talk about both. Yes. Yes.
kind of mix them together, and they're not the same thing.
I think it's worth discussing differences.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
That's why I was struggling with trying to figure out, because I didn't know how to. Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll do both. So join us next week for that discussion. If there are any other topics that you'd like us to cover, feel free to put them in the chat or just post it on our Facebook page or group. We'd love to get to those as well. So, any other last comments that are worth noting, since my phone apparently is not updating at all?
no, Rachel asked what the test was called, and I said implicit bias, but we'll try to post a link.
Yeah, what we can do is I figure we can probably post a picture of
Yeah.
these books and then post a link for implicit bias. And that may be good to just do on Juneteenth is to take that.
Yes,
implicit
that's
bias
what you
test.
can do
Yeah.
to honor Juneteenth, is to take the implicit bias test.
But also see if you can find these books in the
Yeah,
library.
and read a book.
So thank you all for watching us tonight. Thanks for the good discussion. We'll see you later. Have a good night.